Yes, sir.
Judge, I think each of us had a couple of clarification questions. I think maybe, probably the state needs to go first.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I just wanted to be clear that whether this witness is to be prohibited from testifying about chronic use and the effects of cocaine on chronic users without any evidence.
Yes, sir. That's included in the court's ruling.
And, Your Honor, will there be an opportunity to ask if there is, this test is a snapshot, is there a way to detect chronic use, and was it done in this case? Can that be asked? With no inference that Mr. Scott was a chronic user. In other words, this is a snapshot of what was there. Are there other things to determine longer term use, and was that done in this case?
I am excluding all of that testimony as being speculative. What's in the record is contained in number 1 in the reference comments. The effects following cocaine use can include, when it lists a number of things, and will be the limit to which he can testify. He cannot testify as to any of it in regard to Mr. Scott, or speculate that he may or may not have been a chronic cocaine user.
Okay, Judge, and under your 404 ruling,
Find him at the door. You can have him come to the door. Jurors, yeah.
Under your 404 ruling, we will be prohibited from speaking of 404 type evidence as motivation, and instead it goes to character. The state had a theory that they introduced that was talked about the motivation to run. It seems like we have a theory that talks about the motivation to run, but we will not be permitted to offer that theory.
Right. You can argue whatever theory you like as a state. You might argue whatever theory they want, but I think the court's ruling should be clear regarding that issue.
Okay, thank you, Judge.
Right on. Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you. And Dr. Rogers, we were looking at the NMS report.
Yes, sir.
And there are some, just very briefly, the results of that, if we could display that, please, which would be 242, I think. So You explain what cocaine is, and I think we know that, and tell us what that result means, not just in an objective manner. What is that measurement, and how is that relevant? How should that be taken?
The result listed here is 36 for cocaine, 36 nanograms per milliliter. That is a relatively low level of cocaine. Of course, there's no such thing as a safe level or a lethal level. In any given time, someone could die from cocaine. It certainly can cause changes in how a person behaves or what they feel at any given level. So what this simply shows is that the compound, the cocaine, is still present in the blood at a level that's high enough to be detected. And because cocaine's breakdown, the half-life, is an average of about an hour, could be a little quicker, could be a tiny little bit slower, we can extrapolate back. We know that the use has been recent. And by recent, I'm defining that as sometime in the last 6 to 12 hours. There may have been repeated use. It could have been one time somewhere in the last 6 to 12 hours. It could have been several doses over the last several hours, several days. But the drug is still present, so it hasn't had time to break down to a level that it's no longer detectable. And for an amount that's not really, really high and lethal, it breaks down a lot faster. So for instance, if you started with a level of say 10, then that's going to divide in half in the first hour and you'll have 5. Then the next hour you'll have 2.5, and then you'll have 1.25, and it'll keep breaking down. After you've gone through somewhere between 6 to 12 hours, that number will be basically so low that the machine can't detect it anymore, and it's essentially out of your system. If it's a very high level, instead of 10, say it's like 20 or 30, then as it breaks down, the number is going to take a lot longer to divide in half to get smaller, or because it's such a high level, the person's going to die from the cocaine within the first hour or two. So it's going to be a very high number in their system. So, I mean, this number could be a small amount of use in the last couple of hours. It could have been a larger amount of use several hours ago. Looking at that in context with the cocaethylene that's present. Again, that's the compound. Cocaethylene is present at 26 nanograms per milliliter. So again, that's a very small amount. Cocaethylene is generated in the body when cocaine and ethanol, which is drinking alcohol, are present at the same time in order to form that compound. It's still there. What we don't see on the positive findings, and it was tested for, is the alcohol itself, the ethanol. So some time period has passed and that the alcohol has been completely metabolized and is no longer detectable. Of course, we don't know if he had, a couple of beers or if he drank, a fifth, the night before. We just know he had alcohol in his system. At the same time, he had the cocaine in his system. And there's a little bit of it left. It's detectable. The cocaethylene can hang out as much as 2 or 3 days, whereas the alcohol should have been burned off a long time ago. If you have enough alcohol that's still present after 2 or 3 days, then you've just been drinking for 2 or 3 days. And then the benzoylecgonine, that's the last thing listed on there. That's the main breakdown product of the cocaine. That is the metabolite. It takes much longer for the benzoylecgonine to break down. It's typically on the order of at least 4 or 5 hours. So the benzoylecgonine can actually hang around for several days. It can be positive for 4 or 5 days, although the benzoylecgonine at that high level with a low level of cocaine is showing that most of the cocaine is gone and the benzoylecgonine has accumulated, but it's not been enough time since the last use that for the benzoylecgonine to start going down and being eliminated from the body.
So I understand this. If you have cocaine in your system, and let's say it's at a level of 10, and as the cocaine starts being metabolized, the cocaine goes down, but the BZ goes up.
Yes, the BZ being the benzoylecgonine, right?
And at some point, the benzoylecgonine, the cocaine is negligible or is gone, immeasurable, and then the benzoylecgonine would follow that and then reduces. It's eliminated by the body.
Right, at a slower rate, but yes. And of course, if you, once you stop using it, then everything starts going away. If you keep using it, then it can kind of keep moving the curve. You know, a little bit goes in, a little bit goes out, a little more goes in, a little more goes out. So there's a balance in there between what you're taking in and what you're getting rid of. But the benzoylecgonine being the metabolite is the thing that starts to show up with the higher number as the cocaine starts to drop.
And I direct your attention to the reference comments on page 2 of the report.
Yes, sir.
Would you agree with the reference comments on the effects following cocaine use in paragraph 3?
Yes.
And are those all present in every use?
No. Each person has potential for those types of things to happen. Again, it depends on how much they use, how much is in their system, how long it hangs around. In general, though, cocaine is a stimulant. It excites the body. You know, one of the things it doesn't really mention, it talks about certain things with the high and the excitement and all this, is that people also get increased body temperature, sometimes just a little, sometimes to the point that it's actually dangerous, and people can then have seizures. Actually, cocaine can raise and does raise the pressure in the vessels inside the head very high. Not in everybody, but in some people it does. So if some people got real high blood pressure inside their head, if they already have high blood pressure, that's even worse, the vessels will break and they'll have a stroke. Cocaine can cause strokes inside the brain. I mean, of course, that's not listed here, and because it doesn't happen to everybody, but there are other things in addition to these basic behavioral things. There are also other medical conditions that can occur.
But you would agree with the description in this, the euphoria, excitement, restlessness, risk-taking, sleep disturbance, and aggression?
Yes, yes, those are some of the basic ones that happen to most people because of how the drug affects your system.
Thank you, Dr. Owens. Please answer any questions that the solicitor might have.
Thank you.
No question.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you. Do I leave the exhibits here?
Yes, sir. The next witness, please.
Your Honor, we advise that the solicitor take a break at 11:30.
I just needed 5 minutes, but it looked good. We can keep going.
All right. Yes, sir.
Ron Webb.
you swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and the jury in the trial in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You state your first and last name, spell your last name, Bob, and Billy.
Ronald Webb, WBB.
Please.
Yes, sir.
Morning, Mr. Webb.
Morning.
Sergeant Webb.
Yes, sir.
And we can tell by your uniform, but why don't you tell the jury so that it's in the record where you work, how long you worked there, your experience in law enforcement.
Work with the City of North Charleston Police Department. I've been there just over 13 years.
And were you in law enforcement prior to working for North Charleston?
I was in the state of New Mexico and the state of Arkansas.
If you would, on April 4th of 2015, would you tell us what your position was at that time?
I was a sergeant with North Charleston Police Department.
So since that time, you've remained in the same position?
I have.
And tell the members of the jury, if you would, what that position is in terms of your daily activity, if you have any supervision responsibilities, where within the city you exercise those responsibilities.
At the time of the incident and to date present, I'm assigned as a central sergeant for the patrol division on a days team.
Let me show you what's been marked as in the evidence as defendant's number 4. And I would like you to give the jury geographically how the city is set up in law enforcement.
The city overall is divided in 3 different bureaus. You have the South Bureau, the Central Bureau, and the North Bureau. Within those bureaus, there are zones within those, in each bureau.
Let me show you defendant's exhibit number 5. Could you tell the jury what that display shows?
It's a map showing the, giving an indication how the zones are broke down within the city of North Charleston.
And what zones do you have responsibility for when you are a sergeant at the North Charleston Police Department?
My immediate areas are zones 4, 5, and 6.
And is there a pointer close by you? We can see zones 4, 5, and 6. And within that geographical area, what type of responsibilities do you have supervision-wise?
Is the patrol supervisor to make sure that I have manpower to get to the calls that are needed, make sure we can back our officers up, make sure we're there to provide a service to the public.
And within that zone, do you have what are called ComStat areas?
We do.
Would you tell the jury what a ComStat area is?
ComStat area is an area where there's more criminal activity taking place, and we focus more attention to that particular area to try to reduce that crime.
And if you would tell us within those zones, particularly Central 4, if there are ComStat areas.
There is.
And would you tell us what they are?
I'm not sure on that particular date what the ComStat area was, but as to date, this date, ComStat area, one of them is Charleston Farms.
And if you would tell and point out to the jury where Charleston Farms is.
Charleston Farms would be the area right around here, just outside of Remount Road, Hanningham area.
And under your supervision of the 6 patrolmen who are assigned to you, how many are assigned to that area?
I try to assign, when I have a full squad, I try to assign 2 per area.
And if I could show you Defendant's Exhibit number 8. Mr. Ackley, can you blow that up so we can see it, please? May I see Defendant's Exhibit number 8, please? Apologize, sir. Sorry. Could you tell the members of the jury what state's Defendant's Exhibit number 8 represents?
We call it a daily matrix.
And what does a daily matrix show? How is it meaningful to this jury?
In the mornings, before we go the road, or hit the road, I will fax a copy of the daily matrix to the dispatch to let them know what officers I have working and where.
So on April 4th of 2015, you were the sergeant of Team 1, is that correct?
I was.
And under your team, you had 6 patrolmen assigned to that Team 1 on that day.
I believe so.
And of those team members, 2 would have been assigned to Charleston Farms, is that correct?
If I would add all 6 officers, yes.
And the reason for the assignments and the location of your patrolmen are based on crime statistics.
I try to have 2 officers per zone. That way each officer has a backup unit, no matter which zone they're in, ComStat or not.
Well, let's look at Defendant's Exhibit number 6. Could you tell the jury what that is, please?
The section within the yellow square looks like a portion of the ComStat zone.
Would that be the ComStat zone, the high crime area known as Charleston Farms?
It looks like it, yes.
And you would have 2 patrolmen, Patrolman Habersham and Patrolman Slager, encircling that ComStat zone on a regular basis. Is that correct?
Yes.
And going back to Defendant's 8, that represents the actual workforce in the Central Bureau of which Zone 4 was part of. Is that correct?
It does.
And it appears, based on this daily matrix, that you were not at your job that day.
Correct.
And it appears that PFC Freer was not at work that day.
That's correct.
And it appears that Officer Bailey was not at work that day.
That's correct.
And it appears that PFC Lawrence was on annual leave that day.
That's correct.
Which left, of the 7 people assigned to work that bureau that day, 3 patrolmen.
That's correct.
And of those 3 patrolmen, both Habersham and Slager were at work.
That's correct.
And Patrolman Banis was at work that day.
He was.
And was April 4th of 2015 a regular duty day? In other words, were there any other assignments made? Was there any special consideration to the distribution of the officers that day?
I couldn't tell you, I wasn't working the street that day.
Do you know whether, when this incident occurred, how many officers were in the Central Bureau working at that time?
I could not tell you.
Is the assignment of patrolmen and supervision for the protection of the men and women of the community that encompasses that zone?
That's correct.
And to preserve peace and good order within that bureau?
It is.
And to ensure the safety of the men and women patrolling that area?
To the best of our ability, yes.
And with respect to the safety of the men and women working for North Charleston, is it custom and practice in a traffic stop for others working that zone or that bureau to start rotating, to start moving towards where that traffic stop is?
Ideally, that's what we would want.
And the purpose for that is for the peacefulness of the stop, to secure both the person being stopped from any problems as well as the officer making the stop.
To somewhat, yes.
Do you know if anybody was available in the Central Bureau to provide that protection on April 4th of 2015?
I wasn't working that day.
Do you know if anybody on April 4th of 2015 at 9:30 in the morning responded to an announcement to the dispatcher that there was a traffic stop? Did anybody respond?
I couldn't tell you.
Do you know if Officer Habersham had been working his
I
assignment?
object, this witness has been asked and answered questions regarding what was going on that morning, and he's answered that he wasn't working that day. He doesn't know what was going on in relation to who was where, except for himself.
I need to hear the complete question.
On any day, April 4th, April 3rd, March, January, February, Christmas Day, what would be the response time to the incident location of Remount and Craig Street from the farthest point in the assigned territory of Officer Habersham?
Objection calls for speculation.
An answer if you know.
You want me to answer, Joe?
If you know.
I couldn't tell you the exact time. Traffic varies throughout the day. Portions of the day it's heavy, of the days there's light traffic.
Are you familiar with the traffic conditions on Saturday mornings at 9:30?
Some Saturday mornings that I have worked, I wasn't on this day.
Could you give us an approximate response time?
If I was the farthest from Charleston Farms, to the best of my knowledge, that would be putting me on Dorchester Road near Apartment Boulevard.
So within the assigned area of Officer Habersham on his route,
If I'm in the same area as Officer Habersham, it shouldn't take me too long to get there.
do you know, even though you weren't there that day, where Officer Habersham was at 9:30 that morning?
I did not.
Do you know where Officer Banis was that morning?
I did not.
Do you know how the assignments, when you are not there, if they come from the Consolidated Dispatch Service?
You talking about for calls for service?
Yes.
Yes, they do go through dispatch.
And so that would be out of the chain of command of Sergeant Webb or replacement sergeant that day?
Well, as the officers are dispatched to the calls, I hear the calls go out.
And if you were present that day on April 4th of 2015, could you have overridden an assignment given to either Officer Habersham, Officer Slager, or Officer Banis who were working that day?
I could have.
So if one of the officers was assigned to leave his patrol area and go to pick up an iPad, you could have overruled that.
I could have.
And you could also overrule a decision to pick up a bench warrant for somebody who was in jail.
I wouldn't have.
You could have.
Well, I would still be responsible to make sure that that warrant was picked up and served.
And if there's one officer on the street in Central Bureau, certainly your assignments would be based on priorities.
Correct.
And picking up an iPad would not have a priority.
I would serve the warrant first.
And picking up a warrant for not paying a fine for a simple possession of marijuana, would that have a higher priority than leaving somebody on the street in Central Bureau by themselves?
Regardless of the warrant for not paying a fine for simple possession of marijuana to a murder warrant, we would serve the warrant first. I would.
For somebody who's in jail?
Don't want them to get released.
Now, how long had Officer Slager been under your authority and supervision?
Approximately 6 months.
And do you know where he was assigned prior to your taking him under your supervision?
It was a night shift team.
He was what?
Assigned to a night shift team, if I'm correct.
And what location?
The south end of the city, if I'm correct.
And do you know what his patrol area, what zone he worked in the South Bureau?
I do not.
Do you know who his supervisors were in the South Bureau?
I know who one of his supervisors were.
And who would that be?
That would have been Sergeant Allen.
And in terms of the men and women under your supervision, do you provide performance appraisals?
I do.
And how often is that done?
We do what's called a chronological entry every month.
And do you do an annual report that goes up the chain of command to the lieutenant, the captain, the major, the deputies, chiefs, the assistant chief, and the chief of police?
I do an annual report and it's turned into my next chain of command.
And you don't know where it goes?
I couldn't tell you exactly where it goes.
And do you know the reason to do those performance appraisals? Why do you do that?
The department uses those appraisals to look at the officer's overall work habits. It breaks down to numerous different sections in there, things that it asks for, in reference to the officer.
And based on those performance appraisals, employees then are counseled to improve, or they're commended for their good work. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
By the way, you're still working for North Charleston, correct?
I am.
And you're due into service today?
I'm working today, yes.
Any apprehension about testifying to this jury in this case before you go back to work?
No.
Now, apparently you evaluated Officer Slager's work performance on December, for a time period ending December 31st, 2014. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that appraisal was done in advance of the reporting date?
It was.
Your appraisal of Officer Slager?
Yes, sir.
And in making this appraisal, did you have to consult with anyone else who supervised Officer Slager during that time period?
In completing this appraisal, I used the chronological entries made by Sergeant Allen.
Because Sergeant Allen had supervised him for the majority of that time period, is that correct?
That is.
Do you recognize this document and several pages attached there too?
May I? I do.
No objection.
Now, we ask that this series of documents, collectively Defendant's Exhibit 63,
Admitted without objection.
in preparing the appraisal of Officer Slager, you consulted with Sergeant Aiken. Is that correct?
No, sir.
Who did you consult with?
I used the chronological entries from Sergeant Allen's notes.
Some Sergeant Allen.
Yes, sir.
Did you speak to him?
I believe I sent him an email or a text message maybe prior to retrieving the chronological folder for this evaluation.
Did you look at Officer Slager's history through that year, what he did, how he performed, whether he did anything in error, whether he was in trouble, whether he was under investigation, whether he received letters of commendation from citizens in the community? Did you look at all that sort of stuff before doing his appraisal?
I reviewed what was in his chronological folder before completing his appraisal.
And he got a very good appraisal.
He got a pretty good appraisal.
And nothing in there to show that any citizen in the community had complained against him. Nothing in there to show that he had any prejudices in carrying out his duties. Is that correct?
To the best of my understanding, yes.
And would you characterize his performance and his person as being one of the better, if best officers under your supervision?
He was a very good officer.
And with respect to his history of activity in terms of traffic stops, calls for service, arrests for felonies or misdemeanors, visiting schools, visiting community locations, civic groups, how did he stack up against the others?
He did what was required of him. Some months he would lead the team, some months he would not.
And did you ever receive any citizen complaints about
I was called to a traffic stop one time in reference to a gentleman requesting a supervisor.
And what was that particular situation about?
To the best of my knowledge that I can recall, Officer Slager conducted a traffic stop. I don't remember what the nature of the violation was, and the gentleman wasn't happy with the stop in general.
Nothing particularly unusual about somebody being upset about getting a ticket?
The gentleman on the traffic stop, I couldn't calm him down either. He was pretty irate.
Was it resolved peacefully?
It resulted in Lieutenant Bowman responded to the scene, and I don't remember what exactly transpired between those two.
Officer Slager didn't get reprimanded or in trouble for that?
No.
Actually, an apology came from the person who was driving that vehicle?
I couldn't tell you.
Now, any complaints about his performance or his attitude in the performance of his duties?
No complaints that I can recall.
And you had access to his history with the North Charleston Police Department when you prepared that report, did you?
We're talking about the appraisal report right here.
Yes.
I had access to the chronological notes for this year.
And did you have, when he came into your, under your supervision, did you have an opportunity to review his history of performance and attitude as a North Charleston police officer in the 5 years that he was there?
I don't know if I would have had access or not. I didn't try to review it. I just went as far back as the appraisal value.
So you would know
Evaluation.
his history then before he came into your unit?
I would not.
While he was in your unit, did he ever have to, other than on the 4th of April 2015, use force to effect an arrest?
I don't recall any incidents of me having to document any type of force that he used.
And would your documents show the number of arrests he made, the number of traffic stops he made, the number of calls for service that he made, and all the other obligations that he had as a police officer?
They show traffic stops, arrests, and some other calls, things that we do as police officers, not all of them.
But hundreds of contacts with members of the community under your supervision. Is that correct?
During the 6 months period that he worked for me, I believe he probably had over 100 contacts.
Well, just traffic stops alone, he had hundreds, correct?
I believe so.
And then calls for service, hundreds?
I believe so.
And contacts with community organizations, schools, correct?
Okay, the school officers are required to do one visit a month to a school.
And he did everything he was assigned to do, correct?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Now, when he was under your supervision or in the year in which you evaluated him, he had to do training as part of the continuing training educational process for law enforcement officers. Is that correct?
He should have, yes.
And do you know whether he attended each and every training he was assigned to?
I don't recall reading where he had failed to miss any training.
And speaking of missing, did he have a reputation for coming to work late or tardy or being absent for sick reasons or anything of that nature?
Not while he worked with me, he did not.
And do you know what training he took in the year that he was under your supervision?
No, sir.
Excuse me, the 6 months under your supervision.
I do not.
Do you know whether or not the North Charleston Police Department has a physical fitness program?
They do not that I know of.
And do you know whether there's any requirement for patrol officers to lift weights, go to the gym, whatever, swimming, running, jogging? Is there any requirement for that?
I've read something in the policy and procedures manual, I can't tell you when, years and years back, where there was something was mentioned in there about officers maintaining a certain physical shape.
And you have an awareness of the physical shape of your colleagues?
Not more than our appearance.
And are the rules that are followed, the policy across the board, whether you're skinny, fat, short, tall, weak, or muscular? Are the policies, do they differentiate on body, build, strength, whatnot?
Not that I know of.
Do the rules of engagement, if you will, the continuum of force that's employed by the North Charleston Police Department and its interaction with citizens make accommodations for the physical fitness of the officer involved?
I could not tell you, Mr. Savage.
And do the rules of engagement or the continuum of force take into account the resistance, the non-compliance of the of the citizen of North Charleston who's being detained or apprehended by a police officer?
It does.
And do the rules of engagement, the continuum of force, have certainty and the amount of use of force compared to the resistance engaged in by the detainee?
It does.
And if you would, tell us how that works.
Without having the policy and procedure manual here in front of me for that time, I can only give you an overview of it.
Well, just what would happen to one of your police officers this afternoon at 2 o'clock? What policy would they follow?
Their current policy that's in effect.
And what is that?
The use of force policy?
Yes.
Yes, there is a use of force matrix. It varies on both sides, level 1 through 6, if I'm correct.
All right. Would you tell us what that is, please?
For an officer presence is one of them. That's the lowest one, officers on scene, is just displaying a presence. All the way up to include, as you escalate through it, to the use of deadly force.
And tell us those steps that one would take.
For
By one of your officers this afternoon. Tell us how you would think through that on the street.
Check the relevant one. Inspector. Suppose a hypothetical about some random officers this afternoon at 2 o'clock.
Objection sustained.
So the rules of engagement, that is the continuum of force, is a policy, correct?
the continuing of force?
Yes.
No, as soon as the subject complies, force stops.
All right, well, tell us the steps that one would employ between presence and lethal force.
You have your presence, you have your verbal commands, you have your empty hand techniques, and then you would move to your intermediate weapons, and you would escalate from there.
And when you say escalate from there, what does that mean?
Well, once you move to the past empty hand techniques, more likely, I'm assuming, a subject would be fighting at this point or resisting, and you may have to escalate to use your aspeton or your taser device.
And you say or. Is it the policy of the North Charleston Police Department if one carries a taser, they do not carry a baton or asp?
I believe it's optional. I believe it's optional.
And in the history of Officer Slager, had he ever violated that policy?
Not to my knowledge.
Had he used his taser in the past?
I don't recall reading anything in here where he discharged his taser prior to coming to my shift.
Was there, if he had used his taser and it was in violation of the policy, first of all, are all those use of force matters investigated?
They are.
Whether it's twisting somebody's wrist or whether it's using a taser, they're all investigated use of force?
If there's a complaint made or something's observed as we're watching the videos, then we would.
Are you aware that every use of force, whether it's soft techniques, hand techniques, pain compliance techniques, or actual use of a baton, OC spray, or a taser, every one of them is investigated?
I know once you get past or you start using your OC spray, your baton, taser, those are investigated.
And you would know, would you not, if there was any finding against Officer Slager for any type of failure to obey the policies and procedures of the North Charleston Police Department?
I would not.
You would not know.
No, that's handled by a separate division,
And what division is that?
Office of Professional Standards.
So, in addition to these policies and procedures that were in effect on April 4th, was there a minimum standard of employees on duty in April of 2015?
Not that I'm aware of.
And is there one now?
There is.
And when was that introduced?
Sometime within the last 6 months, if I'm correct.
And would have the manpower on the streets of North Charleston on April 4, 2015 met the standards that are now in effect in North Charleston? Do you know?
They would have not.
With respect to the supervision that you employed, did you carry out the instructions from your supervisors in terms of responsibility, activity, proactive policing that was given to you by the lieutenant, the captain, the major, on up to the chief?
All right. You're going to have to repeat that, Mr. Savage.
Did you receive instructions, written instructions from the captain over you with regard to police officers sitting under a shady tree?
I believe I received some complaints of officers sitting under shade trees.
Was Slager one of them?
No, sir.
And were officers encouraged to make good use of their time by effecting traffic stops, pedestrian interviews, in the words of the North Charleston Police Department, getting to know the community?
They were encouraged by me. I don't know about the North Charleston Police Department.
And tell us a little bit about that encouragement. What was encouraged, and why was it encouraged?
Having the officers engage with the citizens, whether it be by traffic stops, whether it be by field contacts, walking the neighborhood, just saying hello, it just shows they're being productive with their time.
And were the officers encouraged to document that?
There are, if I'm correct, there were places where they could keep track of that.
Well, in the tickets themselves, if there was a traffic stop, would they be required to write out a ticket or a document, a piece of paper, to indicate address of the person stopped, the name of the person stopped, the driver's license, the race, the date of birth?
There's two of them. There's a warning citation and an actual citation. The warning citation doesn't require the address of the person
And
stopped.
how would one keep track of an officer with regard to their respect for all citizens of the community?
The officers would fill out at that time, the officers had a daily check sheet they would fill out on how many citizen contacts they did, how many calls for service that they handled.
And the racial composition of those that they would stop?
Can you repeat that?
The race of the individuals they stop, whether they're Hispanic, whether they're African American, whether they're Caucasian, whether they're Asian, that would be documented, would it not?
On the citation or warning citation itself.
Because you as a supervisor, you'd be concerned with any of your patrolmen who may be stopping people on a discriminatory basis.
If I knew about it, I would be.
Because that is a problem.
If they were doing it, it would have been a problem.
And in every stop that Officer Slager made, there would be a video recording of that. Is that correct?
We would like for that to be correct, but it's not, because sometimes those cameras don't work. Sometimes officers didn't turn them on.
Well, based on the reports that were made and based on the videos that were examined, was there ever a concern that there was any discriminatory practice on the part of Officer Slager?
Not to my knowledge.
On the day in question, that is April 5th, you were not on duty that morning. Is that correct?
April 5th, I couldn't tell you if I was or not.
April 4th of 2015, I apologize.
I was not on duty.
But you were working a part-time job,
I was on my way home from a part-time job.
and that part-time job you worked in uniform,
I did.
and that part-time job had been approved by your supervisor to work a part-time job that day. Is that correct?
I don't know if my supervisor approved it, but it was one of the part-time off-duty options out there that we could work.
Because somebody over you controls and ensures that the number of men and women working for North Charleston on the street, that there's a sufficient number of officers patrolling, correct?
That would be correct.
And somebody gave you permission to be off that day.
I believe I was receiving time back that day. I'm not sure without looking at that matrix again.
And the other, if we could put that up, the daily matrix for April 4th of 2015, please, Mr. Ackley, Central Bureau. Officer Freer had been known for several weeks that he would be on sick leave. Is that correct?
Mr. Savage, you're going to have to repeat that question.
The last name on the matrix, Freer, I believe it is, how long prior to April 4th had the management of North Charleston known he was going to be on sick leave?
I don't know.
And Officer Bailey, how long did the management of North Charleston Police know that he would be on light duty that day?
I don't know.
He was injured on the job, was he not?
I honestly don't remember why he was on light duty status.
Can you tell the jury that you didn't find that out on April 3rd?
Mr. Savage, if I knew about it, I don't recall it at this time.
I apologize. And what about Lawrence? Annual leave, how long in advance is that requested?
I couldn't tell you how long that annual leave was requested, but per policy, it's supposed to be 10 days.
And your leave that day, TMBK, AIMS, I'm interpreting that as being time back
For training.
for training. And how long ago was that training that you had?
I don't recall.
But there's somebody over you, a lieutenant, captain, major, a deputy chief, assistant chief, 4 deputy chiefs, assistant chief, and chief, that would have this type of information available.
If it was sent to him, yes.
And CSO down at the bottom there, it appears that a CSO, Jay Lynch, was working in the Central Bureau that day. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you tell the jury what a CSO is?
They're a community service officer. They're the ones who will come and help you change a flat tire, jumpstart your vehicle, unlock your vehicle. They handle report calls for us, things like that.
And perhaps pick up an iPad that was left by a tourist in a rental car.
They could.
But you weren't there.
Was not.
Now, you did arrive at the corner of Craig and Remount at some time that morning.
I did.
And you did that, can you tell the jury why you arrived, when you arrived, what caused you to go in that direction?
Officer requesting assistance.
Who was the officer?
Officer Slager.
And what did you hear that caused you to respond for assistance?
I remember hearing a transmission that he was chasing a subject down Craig Street.
Did you respond at that time?
I don't believe so.
And what did you hear next?
I believe he asked for Officer Habersham to step up his response, and then that's when I started responding in that direction.
Now, with respect to the traffic stop, the initial traffic stop, did you hear that on the radio?
No, I did not.
Is that traffic stop broadcast to everyone working with the North Charleston Patrol Division who was working that morning?
We work off of 3 separate channels. It would have been broadcast to the officers on that particular channel.
And was there anybody listening to that channel in the Central Bureau?
I have no idea.
You what, sir?
I can't say.
Is there anybody working in the Central Bureau other than Officer Slager at that time?
Dispatchers working. They should be monitoring the channel.
And the answer would be no then, I guess. Dispatch can't respond to a crime scene, can they? They're sitting at a desk looking at a computer.
Just a moment, sir. Yes.
Jay, he testified he wasn't working that day. He doesn't know who was listening to what or what.
Objection sustained.
On any day of working day in which your shift is working, does a broadcast for a traffic stop go out to everybody who's working in that bureau?
Goes out to everyone who's monitoring that channel.
And would that be limited to the Central Bureau, or would it include the Southern Bureau as well?
Some officers like to scan channels, some do not.
And you headed in that direction following the Step It Up 156 call. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Why did you respond to that? What was it about that call that didn't get your attention in the foot chase? Why did you all of a sudden pay attention to that and head in that direction?
When the officer asked for assistance, I didn't know where his immediate backup was. I didn't have any knowledge that I can recall of where the officers were at that time, but I knew I was going down the interstate and I wasn't far from his location.
You were off duty.
I was.
And what was it about the tone, the words in the call for assistance that got your attention?
It's not often an officer comes across the radio and asks for other units to step it up.
And what about asking a specific officer to step it up?
He did, if I remember correctly.
And that was his partner,
It was.
who should have been working.
Objection, Your Honor, to one more question.
Where was that officer? If he was in his regular duty assignment, how far away would he be?
It varies.
But his duty assignment is around the Charleston Farms, correct?
Correct.
And he called specifically for that officer.
He did.
In normal times, he would have been the closest officer to you.
I don't know.
Now, did you meet with Officer Slager that day?
I did.
And did you have a
Your Honor, we have a matter of law.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you go to the jury room, please, and that's Yes.
Your Honor, again, this is the matter that we approached just prior to this witness testifying. I believe Mr. Savage is intending to get into self-serving hearsay statements that Mr. Slager made to this witness, and we would object to them coming in by this witness. We would ask that Mr. Savage proffer this testimony. We don't believe that there's an exception to the hearsay rule, and that this avenue should be stopped, and you should rule in limiting on that.
All right, Mr. Savage.
Could I ask specifically what the testimony is that's objected to? We've had plenty of statements that were made by officers, so you have one to a number of officers which the state has introduced. I guess those are called confessions, and these are called self-serving statements. I don't understand the distinction. If I could know what not to ask, perhaps I would ask.
There's a big distinction under the rules of evidence and the hearsay rules. And we have offered evidence of statements that the defendant made to Lieutenant Bowman. And those overheard by Officer Gann to Lieutenant Bowman. Those are the only statements at the scene that we have offered. I object to any statements that the defendant made to this witness because they are hearsay, and there is not an exception that applies.
Mr. Savage.
It's a statement made by Officer Slager during the course of his presence at the incident site. I guess you would call it incited utterance because the defendant has the same principle involved. If they can selectively pick out his statements and call one a statement against interest and one a statement in interest, and they're all made at the same time on the same people, there's just no record. It's just, I don't know why one would be hearsay and another wouldn't. I don't understand the legal argument.
Well, I don't know what the statements are. You haven't asked the questions. There is an objection. The state wants to proffer the statement, so the court can rule. The question is whether or not in the end, whether or not the statements will tend to exculpate the defendant from the crime charge, and if it does, then they can be determined to be self-serving statements and inadmissible. Court in State v. Terry says where a defendant is attempting to exculpate himself with a confession and a defendant seeking to make exculpatory statements must face cross-examination unless corroborating circumstances clearly indicated the trustworthiness of the statements. I don't know what you're seeking to elicit from him. The state is objecting so that inappropriate testimony is not heard by the jury.
Take a shot at it.
All right.
Ready? Start with. The last question I asked you was whether you arrived at the scene and whether you had an opportunity to see Officer Slager on the morning of this incident.
I did.
And tell the court, if you would, don't want to repeat, but you said you heard something on the radio, you went there. When you got there, who was there?
When I arrived on scene,
Yes.
I made contact with Officer Slager.
And tell us the interaction you had with Officer Slager. Action, not words. Tell us the action that you took and how he responded at that time.
I had removed Officer Slager away from the defendant.
Away from Mr. Scott?
I did.
We refer to him as Mr. Scott, please.
Okay. Once I removed them away from Mr. Scott, I removed his duty weapon. I replaced my weapon, duty weapon, into his holster. I secured his duty weapon in the trunk of my vehicle.
And did you, during the course of that action, have conversation with him, or did you pose questions to him, or did he pose questions to you?
After placing his weapon in the trunk of my vehicle, I had Officer Slager sit in the front passenger seat of my assigned unit. And then we had a conversation, or we exchanged words.
And did you inquire to him about the incident site?
I did.
And what would be the purpose of making that inquiry?
So I could, it was a wide area, that way I could find the general vicinity of the incident and start securing evidence.
Were those questions asked of him for the purpose of securing the crime scene?
They were.
And what is the purpose of securing the crime scene?
To protect the evidence within. Also, I had concerns of shell casings, as I knew from experience EMS would be responding, there would be other officers responding, and to start protecting that stuff before it got mushed down in the grass.
So when you arrived, it was within the time frame of where the crime scene was relatively in virgin shape. Is that, in other words, it wasn't tainted or disturbed by others at the time you arrived?
To the best of my knowledge.
And the question that you asked of Mr. Slager was what?
I was trying not to get into the incident itself. I just asked him for an area of the incident and approximately how many shell casings would I be looking for.
And did he answer?
He did.
And what was the answer?
6. I fired 6 shots.
And did he tell you the location?
He gave me a vicinity of the location, yes.
And as a result of that information, did you make an effort to preserve the crime scene?
I did.
Or the shooting scene at that time?
I did.
Now, other than removing his weapon Why did you remove, excuse me, why did you remove his weapon?
To protect it from being reloaded, magazines exchanged, to try to preserve it in the closest condition to the incident as it was during the incident.
The purpose of removing the weapon would be the same as to designate the area of the cartridges, that is to preserve the crime scene or the shooting scene.
It is.
And where did you put his weapon?
I secured it in the trunk of my vehicle.
Was that decision subsequently overruled by one of your superiors?
It was.
And tell the court about that.
As I understand it, the objection is as to statements made by Officer Slager. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So,
Well, if I could know what the statement was, I'd go right to it.
well, you're asking him what he did and why he did it and so forth. The objection is to statements made by Officer Slager, and that's what a proffer is requested
And the
concerning
proffer-
any statements made by Officer Slager.
The proffer is only appropriate when it's placed in context with the actions that were taking place at the time the statements were made and the purpose for the questions and the responses. So if I could be told what the issue is, I will go directly to that specific statement and not waste the court's time.
Page 92.
Pardon? Is it too much trouble to ask you what the...
I said page 92 of the discovery, which you have.
I don't have an ESP. So, did you make contact with Officer Slager in the presence of Lieutenant Bowman?
I did.
And do you know, time-wise, the time that expired between the incident and the time you made contact with Slager, with Lieutenant Bowman?
I do not.
You don't remember the time lapse,
I don't know what the time lapse was.
but it was with Lieutenant Bowman at the scene?
I did make contact with Lieutenant Bowman and Slager together once during the scene.
And did you have a conversation with Officer Slager?
Later, I did.
Later being when?
Well, there were two incidents throughout the time that I was on scene where I spoke to Officer Slager.
And did you speak to him in the presence of Lieutenant Bowman?
I don't recall if we spoke or not when we were all together.
Did he ever tell you about what happened, about giving chase to Mr. Scott?
That was during my later encounter with Officer Slager, and he did.
And when you say later encounter, was that at the scene?
It was between his car and the shooting location.
The answer is yes, it was at the scene?
Yes, it would have been.
So it was at the
Been there,
time
nearby.
frame between Slager, from the time of the incident to the time he was taken from the scene?
It was before he was taken from the scene.
And can you give us an approximate time in that? How long after you arrived? How long after your conversation did he leave? Tell us, try to orient us into when the...
I honestly don't know. I can give you an approximate time of my first contact that we spoke, but I can't give you the second one.
Did he describe to you, or did you ask him a question, what had happened that morning?
I don't believe I asked him what had happened.
Well, let me show you a statement given to me by the solicitor, and I want to direct you to the second page, first full paragraph. Ask you to read it and refresh your memory to see whether or not that's accurate or not.
Thank you. You want me to read the paragraph?
I just want you to refresh your memory. I don't want you to read from that. I just want you to recall when you were interviewed, if that's the statement you gave to the Slage. Okay?
All right.
Did you have a conversation with Officer Slager about what transpired that morning?
I did.
And what did he tell you?
He informed me that he was doing a traffic stop and Mr. Scott had fled from his vehicle, that he gave chase down Craig Street, that he discharged his taser, striking Mr. Scott on the back. Then he discharged his taser, striking Mr. Scott on the front. And I believe it had in there that he didn't have an effect whenever he struck him with the taser on the front. He next stated something about that he was on Scott's back and that Scott took the taser from him.
And did he use any physical description? Did he use his hands, or did he use any nonverbal communication to show you what happened?
He used his both hands and he made an indication, which I took to believe that would have been Mr. Scott pointing his taser at Officer Slager.
And then you talked about the chaplain and what?
I did ask him if the,
That was fine. Your Honor, that's what we would ask him about, the specifics of what the state had an objection to.
All right. And explain the objection again.
It's hearsay. And it's a violation of Terry,
In what way?
because the defendant has not testified and he is attempting to offer his own statements, which are hearsay, and he hasn't explained an exception. It's not a prior statement by a witness, and it's not an admission by I'm sorry, Your Honor. It's hearsay. He's attempting to offer his own self-serving statements to mitigate the facts of this case. And he can't do that, particularly when he has not testified. There may be some situations, if he does testify, where this may be allowed, but that's going to be very limited too. We'll take that up at the time. The rules provide that we are allowed to introduce these sorts of statements, and that they are not hearsay when we offer them, when we offer an admission by a party opponent. They do not allow for the defendant to get in his story through another witness. And it's clear from what this witness testifies to, that this would be a self-defense claim by Mr. Slager when offered by Mr. Slager, which is what they're attempting to do.
Mr. Savage?
Well, there are a number of reasons we believe that this is probative evidence and allowable under the rules, not the least of which Mr. Durant on several occasions, as did Ms. Wilson, challenged the statements given to others for their lack of specificity. The words that ring in my ears are, did you tell him he kicked you, spit on you, punched you, and all the details of that. That has been challenged. And here we have a statement made to Officer Webb immediately after the incident that included those details. They can't have it both ways. They can select what they have done and selectively chosen who he spoke to, and then challenge them for the lack of specificity. So what was said to Officer Webb fills in those details that they've challenged the lack of, and we believe in, if this is a search for the truth, that this information should be presented to the jury.
The statement is excluded under 804B3. And I sustain the objection as to the statements. Let's see, now, did the jury start eating or not? All right. And we're going to break for lunch for 1 hour and 15 minutes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We'll say,
Your Honor,
yes, sir.
recess, if you could consider the testimony that's been previously offered, cross-examination, and testimony of Levi Miles, with specific acting out in front of the jury, and then questioning of that witness about what was shown and what was not shown, in furtherance of our effort to get the statement to evidence. We appreciate it.
Yes, sir. In response to that?
No, sir.
All right. Yeah, well, I think the test on all of this is who's offering the statement. And the rule is 804B3. And it's not admissible unless corroborating circumstances clearly indicate the trustworthiness of the statement, and considering statements of other witnesses by the state does not allow the court to make a finding that
We would suggest 803, 2, and 3.
as I was saying, it would not allow the court to make a finding that the corroborating circumstances clearly indicating the trustworthiness of the statement. And you mentioned which rules again?
803, 2, and 3.
803, 2, and 3. It's 804. Solicitor?
Your Honor, again, first starting with 803.3, it specifically excludes statements of memory or belief to prove a fact from memory. I don't think that applies at all. As far as the excited utterance, we're talking about some time after the event. An excited utterance would be more in line with the calls to dispatch versus statements to fellow law enforcement sometime after an event has occurred and there has been time for reflection and consideration of the gravity of the situation. Neither of those apply.
You requested the court consider it. We'll consider it over lunch.
Thank you.
We'll be back at 2:05. 2:05.